but I just said, welcome to Curzon, Curzon Living Room, which is a session of live Q&A events on Curzon Home Cinema. I'm Mark Kermode. I'm now unmuted. I'm a film critic. Most importantly, I absolutely loved Poly Styrene. I'm a Cliche. I'm thrilled to be joined by Celeste Bell and Paul Sung, who are the co-directors. If you're watching live, we're taking your questions via comments on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. Our Twitter handle is @Curzon Cinemas. Please use the hashtag I'm a Cliche. We'll read out as many as we can. Everyone can hear me. Celeste, let me start by asking you, tell us the background to where this documentary, which I just loved, came from.
Thank you. It was at the end of 2016, the very talented writer Zoe Howe and I started on a book project, which was published a couple of years ago, called Dayglow. And very soon after we started working on that, Zoe introduced me to Paul. And Paul had just finished making Dispossession, the film about the social housing crisis. And well, I'll let Paul sort of finish that story of how he and Zoe sort of came to meet, and then it all kind of happened from there.
Paul, do you want to pick it up?
Yeah, so Celeste and I met Zoe in a cafe in London Bridge, and we started talking about ideas for a film. And one of the first questions I said to Celeste was, would you be willing to write 10 letters to your mum about 10 iconic locations in her life? And then the idea would be that we would visit those locations and film tracking shots around them to kind of explore the present that way through Celeste, through these letters. And we would explore the past through interviews with key eyewitnesses and use archive rather than talking heads. And Celeste wrote these brilliant letters. I mean, I still get goosebumps remembering the first one. And over time, that turned into a voiceover that was a bit more traditional than letters. And so Celeste became a pivotal figure that kind of walks side by side with her mum in the film. And I think for us, that was a much more interesting story with Celeste in it. It's obviously Poly's life on its own is fascinating. There's so much drama there, but with the mother-daughter story, it goes beyond being a documentary about a musician and an artist, and has that real sort of universal theme, I think.
Paul, you're a lot younger than I am. Were you already aware of Poly Styrene's work, and had you? Because I mean, I kind of grew up with it, and it was so I was absolutely there from the beginning. But your experience must have been very different.
Yeah, I mean, I was in my mum's belly during the punk years, so if I was at a punk gig, I wouldn't have known about it. But I knew Germ for Adolescence, I knew Oh Bondage Up Yours, I knew Dayglow. But then meeting Celeste and sort of finding out, there was Translucence and there was Poly's final album and there was another X-Ray Spex album. And, Poly was a fantastic songwriter. She was a punk musician, but she was so much more, in another timeline, maybe Poly would have, worked at somewhere, writing songs. She could have knocked out songs in the Brill Building, something like Highly Inflammable, that kind of 3-minute bubblegum pop. So I knew a bit about Poly, but finding the story and learning more from Celeste, filled in a lot of gaps and made the story more interesting to find out more, as we were making it, really.
Celeste, tell me about the challenge of doing this, because obviously it's it's confronting your past and your religion. That's a heavy thing to do. Was there anything about the project that worried you in advance?
I don't think it really worried me. More than anything, it was cathartic. It's kind of a form of therapy, let's say, and writing, the very first stage, which was just writing down my memories, I found that actually very helpful, because memory is a funny thing. We remember things. Some of the memories we have may not be memories. They may be sort of stories that we've heard and things like that. Yeah. So just that whole process of writing down my memories and going back there, I actually found very helpful and like a free form of therapy more than anything.
Did you discover things about yourself and about your mum during the course of making the film?
Yes, I discovered so much about my mum and myself. I would say the interview process, so where we were interviewing people that knew my mum, you know, before I was born, people that I hadn't met. They had so many rich stories. For example, Rena Vagano is a lady that I interviewed, and she was a promoter at the Roundhouse, and she worked alongside my mum for a period. And you know, she had just a wealth of knowledge of that period. So many things she told me that, you know, I'd never heard before. And some of them were quite shocking. And, you know, there were things maybe that my mum, you know, hadn't really wanted to share, or, you know, she didn't really want to talk about. So that was definitely, you know, a real learning kind of journey for me.
Paul, where did the idea for that central device of having Celeste literally there turning through the pages of Poly's life, where did that come from, and what does that bring to the film?
Yeah, so the scenes in the book we filmed in a studio in Bristol, and I think Celeste, that was your idea, because Celeste and I had written this fantastic book, and you know, when you've got someone just sat in a studio, there's only so many sort of moments they can just stare into the camera. You know, we had sort of got the book there, and we just thought, you know, hang on. One of the themes that kind of, you know, runs through the story is that it's moments of it are like a fairy tale in terms of Celeste narration, in terms of the cinematography. You know, when you've got those tracking shots down the pier and the way the crowds are moving, and when we're back to Vedanta Manor. So I think having a book that is actually the story worked really well as a visual device. I mean, I've seen somebody, I think it was on Twitter, sort of thought that it was a prop. You know, and it was kind of like, if it was a very good prop, but it was actually a real book. And the film is tells a good story. I think we said before, you know, it could have been a series, it could have been a podcast, but you know, the book is fantastic because you've got so much more in there. And obviously we can do things in cinema with music and sound and everything else, but I'd recommend the book to anyone that's interested in Poly because it's fantastic.
There's also an element, because you have that central device of somebody sitting reading a book, it brings an element of fairy tale into it. It's like you know, what you're reading it's truthful, but it has an element of fairy tale. Celeste, did you feel that?
Definitely. And we worked with our editor, Zanna Ward-Dixon, and we spoke about this a lot. You know, we had discussions about the fairy tale element. It was kind of obvious, it was there from the beginning that it had this potential, and it was something that we really wanted to explore, because there is something fairy tale like in the story. I think, especially in my story, because a lot of, you know, my very early memories, I was a very small child, you know, 3, 4, 5 years old. And so everything is a bit like a fairy tale when you're that age, and that's kind of how you see things, and how you see characters and people and situations, you know, or at least I did. I was a very imaginative kid who loved fairy tales, in fact. So I think it was really important, yeah, to have that element, and you know, not go over the top with it. But I'm really happy that you kind of noticed that sort of feeling.
I'm struck by how much archive there is available, because quite often you don't know when you go into these projects how much there is. Did you know that there was a wealth of, I mean, obviously from the book you'd researched that, but did you know that there was a wealth of stuff that would come together to make a film?
I mean, we knew that we had access to some great unseen footage, a lot of footage that my mother's manager, Falcon Stewart, who was a filmmaker, that he shot of the band, so rehearsal footage, footage of my mum at a Sex Pistols gig, for example, that you see in the throughout the film. But that was, you know, not very long in terms of minutes, and we wanted to find a lot more footage of my mother being interviewed, and footage of the time, you know, so archive footage of the 70s. So that whole process of finding, you know, we had to find everything that was out there, and it really took a long time. So the archive research was a huge part of this filmmaking project, definitely.
Paul, what was the greatest challenge for you in finding stuff? What was the thing that you found the hardest to get hold of?
I mean, I wouldn't say it was necessarily things that were hard to get off in terms of finding. It was raising the budget. I mean, as we know, documentary funding is scarce, particularly in the UK. And I think, you know, there is money out there, but there are so many interesting, fascinating projects going for the same pots of money that it can be quite difficult. And it did take us a while to get enough money to kind of afford what we wanted. And we got there in the end. But I think one of the great things for an editor is that craft of being able to, you know, you've not got to worry about lip sync or anything like that when you don't do talking heads. And so you can be much more creative in terms of the story that you tell visually with these great eyewitnesses. So I think one of the challenges would have been at some point when we were watching rushes and thinking, you know, the first thing we watched was like a section on New York. It was half an hour long. It didn't feel like half an hour. It was fascinating because New York, as we know in that period, you know, in the late 70s, early 80s, is very different to the New York that we have now. And so I think one of the challenges when you've got a really long section like that, like with any film, is kind of getting it down, because, you know, that New York section that Zana cut could have been a short film or, you know, a 30-minute film on its own. So yeah, the challenge really, I suppose, was, you know, being able to actually have the money to pay for the archive.
We you know, we were very fortunate to have, you know, support funding from the BFI, Creative Scotland, and you know, we got there in the end. But I think one of the reasons why we needed so much archive footage as well is because we didn't have the talking heads. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that also became a bigger challenge for our editor, and it was, you know, there's so many great stories that you hear, you really want to bring them to life, and you know, using archive footage of the time, it was the best way to do that.
So as you talk in the documentary about times in which you thought, you know, I wish that I had an ordinary life, I wish I had an ordinary mother, and because that story is so extraordinary, what was it like to confront that? Because it felt very personal and very honest and very open, and I think the documentary really benefits from it. But that is very personal stuff that you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the only way that we could make, you know, a good film was to be honest. Yeah. You know, being honest about my experiences and how I felt was you know, a big part of that. And I was aware of, you know, that's what it was going to take from the outset. And as you know, I think I'm quite an open book as a person, and it wasn't necessarily like difficult for me. I think it was probably more difficult having to you know, cut down on, because I could have, you know, just gone, you know, spoken a lot more, let's say, about the Hare Krishna movement, my experience in the temple and things like that, but we were really limited in terms of time. Mm-hmm. So I think actually one of the hardest things was taking like my narration and saying, oh, well, I've got to actually cut some of this out because there's just too much. But yeah, I think it wasn't hard for me to be honest about the difficulties. And I would say that, you know, I wished when I was a child that my mum was sort of ordinary and normal. But obviously I don't, you know, wish that anymore. I'm very, very grateful that I had the mother that I had. Yeah.
And you must have put an awful lot of trust in Paul to work on this project together.
Yes, I think we had to put a lot of trust in each other. And it was, you know, we started this project 5 years, we're entering into the 5th year. So, you know, we've got to know each other really well, and we've built a friendship. And I think that's, you know, really important. And we've just had such a great team, you know, apart from Paul and myself. You know, we've become like a family in a sense, making this project, you know, daily contact. Is, you know, be very strange, it'd be very difficult for me when I don't have this in my life anymore. I mean, like a big hole.
Yeah.
Paul, how important is it to you that the film is opening now? I mean, obviously I saw it, you know, streaming, and it's now going to be available through streaming, but I would like to see it in the cinema. I mean, there were sections in it I thought, I want to see this up on a big screen. Paul, how important is that to you?
It's absolutely vital that, you know, you watch a film like this and you're immersed in it with the sound, and that we've got lots of people that are listening online, but that we're all in a room talking about it, and, you know, people putting their hands up and telling us their story, what Poly meant to them. And as soon as we can do that, I really hope that we're all going to do that, possibly later in the year. And I don't think cinema should have closed to the extent that they did. You know, there can be safe spaces, they can control numbers, you can, you know, have health and safety. So hopefully it's all, you know, we're back there soon.
And are there plans to do showings of the film with live music?
Yes, definitely. You know, that our initial idea of doing screenings and events was, you know, having music be really central. And there are so many great bands out there who, you know, were inspired by my mum in some way or another. And of course, we interviewed so many great musicians as well. It made a lot of sense for us to have a gig be part of the experience. So that's definitely something we will, you know, be trying to do as soon as we're allowed.
I remember really clearly as a teenager, somebody gave me a copy of The Boy Looked at Johnny, which was, you know, the Tony Parsons, Julie Burchill book. And it had a thing at the frontispiece of it when you opened it up, and it had a picture of Tom Robinson and a picture of Polly, and it said, "You will be king and you will be queen." And it was funny because I found my copy of it just after watching the film again. And I opened it and I thought, that was incredibly on the money, because at the time, that wasn't necessarily the view that everybody had. And the thing that Parsons and Burchill said about Polly having the most brilliant mind of her generation, I was just looking at that and thinking, that is unbelievably prophetic. At what point did you know that that was the level of impact that Polly was having?
I think I knew it for quite a long time, since I discovered for myself her music. So I was a teenager and I really listened to her music, listened to the album Germ-Free Adolescence. I would have been 14, 15 years old. And I was genuinely blown away by the lyrics, because they really spoke to me, you know, as being a teenager. And I think they speak to not just teenagers, they speak to everyone. Everyone can find something that they can relate to. They're kind of universal, those lyrics. And I think, so I knew then that what a talented writer my mum was, and I was really aware of the strength of her songwriting, and I just knew that would continue. The album was classic, you know, it's a classic album. It will continue to find fans and people who get something out of it.
Paul, did you look to any other music docs when you were putting this together, or were you just entirely guided by Celeste's story?
When we first met, one of the references that I had was Julian Temple's Filth and the Fury. And I saw a Q&A of him at the ICA a few years back, and someone asked about why the band were in silhouette. And he laughingly said, you know, because no one wants to see them now they're in their 40s. And the reason for using Talk was partly inspired by, you know, Asif Kapadia's style of filmmaking, you know, in Amy and Senna. Because we wanted to transport people back to the past. When you see an archive from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even before that, if you're seeing, you know, Don Letts or Jonathan Ross or Kathy Hanna in the present day, you're not going to necessarily be as immersed. And the story we wanted to tell needed to sort of cover different time periods. We wanted to sort of avoid that. And so there were films that were kind of reference points, but really the film sort of became so much more than a music doc, and it was really guided by this journey that Celeste was on, and the fact that Celeste was willing to be so honest. And there was never at any point where we, you know, as a team said to Celeste, you know, can you do this, because she just went there. She went there on her own and she took us with us. And so we were really grateful that the film became so much more than just a standard music doc.
Celeste, we have a question. This is from Esri via YouTube. What do you think your mum would make of today's identity politics? Is the world finally catching up with Polly?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel in many ways the world has caught up with my mum, and I think there are elements of sort of the conversation around identity that would have been comforting to her, because you know, she was grappling with things that weren't really being discussed at the level that they are now. So I think, yes, in many ways the world has caught up, but there's still a long way to go. And I'm sure my mum would have been very critical of, you know, so many of the problems and hurdles that people face with, you know, with identity and with all of these issues that she was talking about.
When you say there were things that she would have found comforting, what do you mean by that? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, I think, well, just for example, you know, in the music scene and in the punk music scene, there is this whole very like vibrant punks of color scene. And you know, and where race is sort of being discussed openly within punk music. You know, this is quite a recent phenomenon, and I think my mum would have felt much less like an outsider in that sense today than she did in the late 70s. I think she just would have found so many more people to relate to, and you know, maybe just a more welcoming environment in that, you know, in these kind of new scenes that have emerged in recent years.
One of the most shocking stories in the film is this, I mean, which it seems trivial, but the story of her being locked in the toilet. It's the level of bullying involved in that, and what she must have had to struggle with. I thought that was I hadn't heard that story before, and I found that really quite shocking.
Yes, and that's the perfect example of how, you know, not very welcoming that environment was that she found herself in. I think, you know, there was being mean and being a bit bullying was quite accepted, you know, and at that time, that's the feeling that I get, you know, that was kind of part and parcel of being cool. And whereas I think we've moved on from there, you know, as a society, especially when we think about British society, I think we have moved on a lot from, you know, we don't accept that anymore, that kind of bullying, laddish, kind of being mean just to be cool behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this is from Simone from London. I loved the use of Poly's diaries. Had you read these before making the film?
Yes. So my mother wrote them retrospectively in the early 2000s. And she was looking back at the album Germ Free Adolescence, and she wrote a short passage to go with each song. So I remember when she was writing them, and I read them way back, and she'd wanted to get them published and she wasn't able. So that's actually where the book project started, was, you know, I wanted to kind of use her diary entries and then combine that with her artwork, because she did all the artwork for the band, and then put that together in a book format. And that worked really well in the book. And we wanted to do the same in the film, because it was really important for us that my mother's voice is present throughout.
Yeah.
You know, so she's as much of the storyteller as I am.
And Paul, tell us about who you got to do the readings of the diary and how that worked.
Yeah, so Celeste and her cousin had a chance meeting on the streets of Soho with Ruth Negga.
How can you have a chance meeting with Ruth Negga? She's like a superstar. It's like,
well, you know, superstars love Soho, Mark. You know that. And they just happened to meet Ruth and hung out with her for the evening. And Ruth is a massive Poly Styrene fan, so Celeste, you know, didn't even have to convince her. I just sort of had a conversation with her agent, and she was wonderful, and came down to a studio, Dean Street Studios, where I think T-Rex Bowie recorded. And we had Ruth for 2 days, but she nailed it, I think, within 4 hours. I offered to come back the next day. It was like, no, you got it. And she was brilliant.
There is a sense, though, of the, you know, people talk about the movie gods, about there are times when the movie gods align for a project to happen. And the idea that you just happen to bump into Ruth Negga, whose voice is absolutely perfect for those diary entries. I mean, if you drew up a list of people that you could have read, doesn't that make you feel like the stars were aligning for this project at this point?
Definitely. I mean, and there were so many moments like that where, you know, it was some, you know, like a gift from heaven, let's say, just fell into our lap, in terms of, yeah, just an amazing interview and these great revelations, and then finding an amazing piece of artwork and a diary entry, you know, like something that my mum had written, you know. It was a constant journey of just discovering amazing stuff and coming across really remarkable people. And that's how this project was able to be realized.
When you look at the film, and it's been terrifically well received, and rightly so, as I said, I think it's wonderful. Paul, what are you most proud of? What's the thing that you look at in the film and go, yeah, I'm really, really proud of that?
One of them would be Celeste, because Celeste, like, you know, this is the first film that she's made, and she's a natural. And people talk a lot about Poly's legacy, and Poly's got a fantastic legacy, and Celeste is part of that. And if Celeste, chooses to, and she wants to, be a fantastic filmmaker, And so I'm proud of making a film with her, with our team, and just the fact that we never gave up. We had various challenges, and we just, were tenacious and got it over the line. And that's my one piece of advice for anyone that's making a film, is just, it sounds quite facile, but just don't give up. Just dig in and make it by hook or crook.
Which is also quite a kind of punk ethos, which is get it done, don't wait for the funding, just get on with it. This has just come in from Ray via YouTube. Punk was about simplicity, accessibility, and disposability. Do you think Poly would have approved of the way punk is looked at now as part of rock heritage?
The important thing, I think, and this is an important message, I think, throughout the film, is that my mum didn't necessarily consider herself a punk. And I think after that initial period of being in X-Ray Spex, it was a short period of her life, 2-3 years, I don't think she really thought that much about punk anymore. It was sort of something in her past, and she never considered herself to be a punk. She considered herself to be part of the new wave. And she also described the music as high energy rock and roll, not punk. So I honestly don't think she actually thought too much about punk, after that. But I think, I mentioned before, the punks of color, Afropunk, this sort of transformation of punk, I think she would find really, really interesting. How punk is become global as well. And it has this global appeal, and it's not just UK, US punk that we all think of, the stereotypical images that come to mind. Punk has become much more of a political ideology, which I think is really interesting.
She always seemed to be much more of a futurist. I mean, she, if you look at the designs, which is obviously such a big part of what she was doing, futurism, Afrofuturism, all that's always where she seemed to me to be situated.
Yeah, you're right, 100%.
I mean, she probably had more in common with Brian Eno than the Buzzcocks,
Yeah, and she loved Brian Eno. She loved, Roxy music. That was a big influence, actually. Also, David Bowie, of course, and T-Rex. Those were kind of big influences for her musically.
And Celeste, where are you musically now? What are your great musical loves?
In terms of what I'm listening to?
Yeah, or
So I have a very eclectic taste. I really love what you could describe, but I think it's a lame way of describing it, but world music. So I'm always looking for, music from around the world. I grew up with a lot of Eastern influence in the music, because growing up in the Hare Krishna movement. So I really love music from the Arab world, anything with those kind of very melancholic harmonies. Really gets me. And I didn't grow up listening to punk. I'm a kid of the 90s. I liked hip hop and R&B, but again, that is for me, hip hop actually kind of took over from punk, and it carried on that legacy, I think, after punk. So yeah.
And Paul, did you come out of this with a newly enlivened sense of music? Has it changed the way you think about music?
Oh, it's a good question. Not really music as such, but certainly artistry. And one thing I didn't know before was that, Poly designed all of the record sleeves, that she'd put the band together. And it made me admire her that much more in terms of, just being one of those total artists. I mean, if she'd had a longer musical career, I do think that, she would have been comparable to people like David Bowie in terms of being an artist beyond the music, as Bowie was.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think one of the things that the documentary really captures is that idea of, design and spoken word and written word and all those things, which, it was more than music. Now I'm getting messages here which say, okay, Mark, you have to wrap up. So I'm going to try and wrap up without turning my microphone off. I want to thank Modern Films for making tonight's event possible. Most of all, thank you to our guests, Celeste and Paul. Poly Styrene, I'm A Cliché is available now to stream on Curzon Home Cinema. If you enjoyed the film and this event, please tell your friends. Upcoming in the Curzon living room, we have on Friday, the 19th of March, director Liv Horvath, who will be in conversation about her new movie, Preparations to Be Together for an Unknown Period of Time. You can follow Curzon Cinemas on Twitter and Facebook for all the latest updates. Paul and Celeste, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. I keep saying this, but I just love the doc. In fact, I'm going to go back and watch it again now, having talked about it, because I think you've done a brilliant job with it. I think you've really captured some of the spirit of of the music and of the design. I think it's really hard to do that. So congratulations. I wish you every success with the documentary. And I really hope that at some point in the not too distant future, we can all actually be in the same room together.
Yes.
I hope so too.
We really would love that more than anything.
Good. Well, I hope the film does get to play in some cinemas. I hope you get to play it with some